Hello, I'm Stormy Styles, owner of Pink and Natural Hair Company, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make a closure wig on the sewing machine. So, some suggestions I have for this video. I would review the video a couple times from the beginning to the end to make sure that you can familiarize yourself with all the steps and that you're prepared for everything that's going to come in each. So, after you review all of the techniques that are demonstrated, then review the supply list to make sure that you have everything. If not, it'll be listed right below this video. Next, then you want to review the supply list just to make sure that you have everything. If not, we'll add our Amazon list where you can obtain everything that's needed for this class, and it'll be right below this video. Once you do that, then if you want to come back and review the video one more time, that's great to get everything in your head so that when you start sewing on your own and everything, you'll be ready to just kind of flow through the steps. Don't rush yourself. Don't worry if it's not perfect the first time. Don't worry if you mess up on a track or the closure or anything. That's what your seam ripper is for. So if you make any mistakes, you can go back in, you can remove the track or you can remove the closure and you can just start sewing again. So practice makes perfect. So don't be too hard on yourself. Don't rush yourself. Just take your time. Even if you do each part in the video on a certain day, maybe in the morning, maybe the next day, or maybe in the morning and then in the afternoon, whichever you feel is best for you. But don't try to do everything at one time. And I just want you to know that, when I started and I made my first wig on the sewing machine, I told myself, and I had to redo it about 3 or 4 times. But after that, I still had some challenges, but after that, by the time I made my second or third wig, I was good to go. And shortly after that, I started teaching because I was like, wow, this is something that I want to share with other women who are at home taking care of their children and would like to work from home. So, that's for another story of how I got into wig making. But please enjoy yourself. Please do your best. And let me know if you have any questions. Just drop them in the comments below. All right. Before we begin with the supply list, I would like to say, if you are new to sewing, please review the tutorial in the description box that teaches you how to use a simple sewing machine before you start your wig making journey. So for this wig making class, you'll need a closure 5x5 or 4x4, 6x6, 7x7, whichever one you desire, and at least 3 bundles of hair. You may use all of them, you may not, but it's always better to have more than enough than not enough hair. So the first thing that you'll need is a simple sewing machine. I like the Singer brand because it seems to be a lot more durable. Then you'll need some weaving thread for your hand sewing. Next, you're going to need sewing machine thread. Then you'll want to get a wide presser foot because it makes it a lot easier for you to see the tracks when you're sewing double tracks. Then you want to get heavy duty sewing needles for your machine. You want to get the one that ends with the 18. Next is going to be your canvas head. You can get the 22-inch, which is a standard, or you can also get one that fits your head size if your head size is smaller or if it's larger. Then the adjustable elastic band. I like to get these as well as the standard elastic because you know, depending on the size of the closure, you may need to stretch it a little farther. So the elastic roll is always good. And then you're going to need your metallic markers for your mapping. You're going to need your T-pins and hand sewing needles for sewing on your closure or your frontal. And then we're at our caps. I like 3 different caps. The dome cap is really good because it has a lot of stretch to it. The next one I like is the mesh dome cap, which is in an extra large, because if you're larger than a 22-inch circumference, these are always good. And then the standard mesh dome caps are good for 22 inches and below. Lastly, these are some quick snipping scissors that I like to use. They're really sharp and they cut the thread evenly when you're sewing to make it easy to put back in the needle.
Okay, so the first thing that you want to do when you get a wig order is make sure that you have the measurements of your client's head. You can ask them to take the measurements with a sewing tape measure, or you can do them yourself. You just want to make sure that their hair is in the state that they're going to wear it under the wig. So if it's going to be cornrowed and it's flat to the surface, you want to make sure that they're getting their measurements with the cornrows in, or if they're going to wear it in a bun or something like that. But don't measure over top of the bun, of course. So the main measurements that I like to use are number 1, the circumference of the head, number 2, from forehead to nape of the neck, number 5, from temple to temple around the back of the head, the occipital lobe, and number 6 for the nape of the neck. So those are all the measurements that I use in order to make my glueless lace closure wigs.
Okay guys, so now it's time to transfer our head measurements onto the mannequin block. And so right now I have the dome cap. This is a standard dome cap that you can use to make your wigs. It's very easy to do your mapping on. This is one of the caps that I use. And what we're going to do first is we're going to take those head measurements that we did and we're going to transfer them onto the blocking so that we can make sure that we have the right measurements when we do our mapping, okay? So when I do my mapping for my wigs, I only use 4 out of the 6 measurements. And so the first one is going to be temple to temple. And remember, mine was 17 inches. Okay. So right now the cap does not reach over to that point. So I'm going to have to take a pin and I'm going to stretch it over to that marker. Okay. And so from that point, I'm going to go back over here again. I know this is upside down, but you still know what 17 looks like. And come back around here. I'm going to leave that point there. Okay, so now if I come back over here to where we began, I'll start from this side, and that's 1 inch. Come around the occipital lobe, and I'm ending at 17 inches. Okay. And then we already have the 22 circumference, so we don't have to do that because we're using a 22 head block. The next one is going to be from your hairline to the nape, and that is 14 inches. So I'm going to take this pin, grab the wig cap. I'm going to grab the wig cap and bring it down to 14. That's 14 inches. And then I'm going to do the nape across, which is 5 inches. So I'm going to put it somewhere around here because it's not right at this line. It's a little beyond that point. I'm going to mark that down for the 1 inch. Come back over here, get my 5 inch point. I've already had a pin right there, so I can see exactly where to insert it. And this is how I'm gonna bring this one down a little bit. I can see that it's a little uneven. Okay, bring that right down to the same level. 5 inches across, 14 from hairline to the nape, 17 from temple to temple around the occipital lobe, 22 inch circumference. Okay guys, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start to map out our lines for where we're going to sew our wefts. All right, and we're going to do double wefts in this class, and we're going to begin right behind the closure. We're using a 5x5 closure. Our closure is already placed, okay? And so the first thing that we're going to do is the outline around the closure. So we're sewing our closure on by hand. But I still like to have an outline for the mapping. So I'm drawing right around the closure. And using this as my guide.
This video will show you how to map double wefts 1 inch apart. If you want to sew single wefts, you'll need to make your wefts a 1/2 inch apart.
Okay. And so the simplest way to map out for your double wefts is going to be, we're going to take this measurement, and we know we're going to need at least 3 bundles of hair, depending on how long your client's hair is, how long their bundles are. So just remember that the longer the bundles, the more hair you need. So I'm going to take the T-pin, And I want to place this a little over to the side because we're going to use this for our guide. And we're going to do our lines about an inch apart. Okay. So we're going to do about 8 or 9 lines for our guide. This is going to be the first one. We're making about an inch apart. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm using this second one for the second dot, because the second line, because I made a mistake right here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. And so I'm going to bend the wig head block down a little bit because I want to make sure that I can see my guides. And from here, I'm just going to go straight across. Turn it around as needed so you can see where you are. Making sure that your lines are the proper width between each other and proper spacing. Just do your best. So when we get to the top, and just ignore this dot right here, we're going to go up to this one. Okay, what I like to do is I'm going to come around, we're going to kind of swerve around and leave this right adjacent to the closure, because I like to sew and seal the closure with that last stitch. I'm sorry, I like to sew and seal the closure with that last weft. So we're going to bring this last long weft all the way around to the end of the closure. And we're going to do the same thing on this side. Lead it right around. Okay. We're going to take this line right here that we're going to make, and we're just going to go straight across. All right. And so if you see the difference from where I made the outline for the closure and where I did this last line, there's going to probably be a gap right here. So what we'll do is we'll take our last weft and we'll sew right across. We'll sew it right across. We'll take our last weft and we'll sew it right across the back of the closure to secure it even more and to close up this space. Okay. Let me go over these lines a little bit more. And that's how you map out your wefts. And so the way that we place our closure is that you want to make sure that when you place this, it is about a 1/2 inch below the hairline. So you're going to give them a little bit more room when they're wearing the cap so that it doesn't go behind their hairline when they wear it. If we place it right on their hairline, then they're not going to have anything to, to cover their hairline. So you want to come down a little bit further, because some people may have willow's peaks like myself. Some people may have, a hairline that's really far up. And so you want to make sure that their natural hairline is not busting through the unit, or if they fit it, and it'll start to move back too. So, you don't want their hairline to show through because the wig is moving back because it's not fitted right. So I'm coming down about a 1/2 inch below the hairline, as you can see, these 3 lines here. This middle line is going to represent the center of the face, where the nose and everything is. So you want to make sure that you kind of get it as even as possible. So this is a 5x5 closure, so it may expand a little bit more past the out the sidelines, but we're going to stretch it, okay, to make sure that's centered to the best of our ability. I'm not going by that part that was there because that was not the actual center. Stretch it over a little bit more. Okay, so this is how we're going to place this in. We're going to stretch it so that the placement is right. Okay. And then you can see, you can pull it down, and once you come back up, you'll be able to see where the hairline stops at. Okay, so this is sliding down, but when I pull it up, because I haven't positioned it in the top yet, I can look through here and see that this may be a little bit below. I don't know if you can see it, but it may be a little bit below a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to move back up just a little bit. And some people go about 1 inch, but just don't really go over 1 inch. So if I get my measuring tape, you don't have to measure it out, but I'm just doing it for educational purposes. So this is about 3/4 of an inch, which is still okay. Because when I go over here, the way that it's framing the roundness of the head, when you come over a little further, it's going to get a little shorter. Distance is going to get smaller as it rounds the head. So the center is about 3/4 of an inch. Around the size of the closure is about 1/2 of an inch. So I am totally fine with that. So your next step is going to be, so we can, you can usually braid this. I'm going to put a clip on here. Some people braid it down. I usually have this braided down, but I'm used to working, you know, with the hair loose, so that's totally fine with me. I'll go ahead and put a clip on here. Okay, because I want you to be able to see that I'm going to grab these 2 sides right here, the back part of the closure, and I'm going to stretch it back. And we're going to spread, let me turn it to the side so you can see. So now I'm taking this pen and I'm using it as an anchor, and I'm stretching it because I'm holding this side as I'm stretching because I want to spread it out so it lays flat. I'm doing my best to lay it flat all the way around, because you don't want one section, or the side section or the back section, to have any bubbles in it. You don't want it to look like that. You don't want it to look like that. You want it to be nice and flat. So I'm stretching it back and I'm spreading it over, okay? Because it's kind of rounded and square at the same time in the back. So that's one anchor over there. So I'm gonna push this all the way down so it's nice and flat. We're gonna come back. We're gonna do the same thing. over here. Okay, so this side is going down flat as well, and then this side is flat too. So just check your work and make sure that your closure is nice and flat going around each side. You don't want any gapping or bubbles or anything like that. So this is good because actually I still stretch it when I sew it, and you'll see in the next video. However, I just want to go ahead and just give it just a little more flatness. We don't have any bubbling or anything. This one I'm going to leave up right here just for you know, the anchoring sake, because this anchor is good. So if it's stretched right here, when I sew it, I know that it's going to be nice and flat, but I don't want to stretch it so much that it's going to, you know, put a little extra indentation in the closure. So I can still sew across here with this being elevated, and then so I'll just turn this T-pin and sew around it, sew around, and then take it out. Okay, but when I sew it, I'm going to pull put a little tension on that corner so it'll stay nice and flat. But this is good. So don't rush yourself with placing the closure and everything, because sometimes if you're just beginning, it may not come out flat right away. I'm used to doing it and everything, but you know, utilize the 3 guidelines in the front for placement. Make sure that the front is at least about a ½ inch away from the wig cap, so that you can have you know, the proper coverage for your client's hairline. And just check your work as you go around. When you are placing the back of the closure, make sure you spread it, you know, in the opposite direction, and flatten it down as you go. And you know, just make sure everything is nice and flat before you start sewing. Okay? Okay, so when you begin to sew on the closure, you're not going to start, when you're sewing by hand, you're not going to start right at the end. I would suggest going back a little further from the beginning of the cap, so the knot is not at the end and it can come loose very easily. So even though we're going to secure it on with the sewing machine, I still like to put this practice in place just in case. So I start a little further back. You don't have to start as far back as I did. Maybe, you know, you could start, I'm probably about 1 inch back. You could start about a ½ inch. And I'm sewed through the cap and through the closure and through the loop of the thread. Okay, you want to make sure that you do not sew the cap to the dome head, the canvas head. Okay, so I'm going to lift it up a little bit. I'm going under this thick elastic, and I'm going to go through the cap, through the closure, and then through the loop. I'm sewing through the cap, through the closure, and through the loop of the thread. This is how you lock it in. This is how you lock your stitch in. Through the cap, through the closure, through the loop, and I'm sewing forward. I'm going to sew forward until I get to the end, and then I'm going to sew backwards and continue around. through the cap, through the closure, through the loop. And I'll show you one little minor trick that I like to do when my clients are wearing their closure units glueless. I will sew all the way to the end of the hair, and I sew it to the cap, because what this does, it gives it a nice flat look when they install it, and it holds it nice and secure and nice and snug. Because remember, we left that 1/2 inch space. I'm going to remove this one so I can continue sewing. This is just a little trick that I found that makes my glueless wig stay on a little more secure and look a little more natural. Because it rounds, it frames, because it frames your face around your hairline. I can also remove this T-pin. Since I have a little more security. Yes. Okay. So you see how it snugs right to the cap? It already has kind of like a natural lay. Okay, and now I'm going to go through this stitch, which is about 4 stitches back. Pull that through, go one more time, a little further back, and remember, we're going to sew right over top of this at the end, so no worries about that. This is just to make sure we don't have that little knot at the end of the closure sitting on someone's head, and then they accidentally cut it, and they could possibly cut too much, and then the closure isn't secured anymore. So I'm going to continue to sew around. Okay guys, so now we've come to the end of our closure. Let me get this clip so I can just move the hair out of the way. And we're going to do the same thing we did on the other side. So we're going to sew all the way to the end. I'm going to lift up the band because it's a little thick here. We're going to sew through the cap, through the closure, through the loop, through the cap, through the closure, and through the loop. So I just want to show you something really quick. So this is why it's important to still do the outline for your closure, because if it gets adjusted or the cap moves around or anything, you know exactly where to sew it at. So I know that I'm going to sew this right over top of this guideline. And we're going to sew. We're going to do our little trick where we're sewing all the way to the end. All the way to the end where the hair is. I'm going to remove this T-pin. All the way to the end. Let's getting a little stuck because of the elastic band that's inside. But that's okay. Keep going. And as you can see, we are at the end. So now we're going to sew backwards a couple stitches. Let's go back one more stitch. And then we're going to go through this loop here because we're ending off our stitching. We're going to go through the loop of the thread. We're going to pull it through one time, tighten it up, go through it again, pull it through again, tighten it up, and that's it. Trim it on the end. Make sure you don't trim too close so that you're not cutting your knot. And now you are ready to sew on your wefts. Now you are ready to sew on your wefts. Okay, so now we're going to sew on our double wefts. And with sewing on your double wefts, you want to make sure that they are not on top of each other, that one is a little below the other, so that they can lay nice and flat on your wig cap, okay? And so I'm going to line them up. I'm going a little bit past the beginning because I want the edge of the wefts to slide out. And so I'm going to sew forward a little. I'm pinching them together because sometimes they slide down. And I'm going to sew backwards. And so as you can see how they started to separate here. So I'm going to move this up. I'm going to go right back in. So then we'll lift it up a little bit because it's just getting a little stuck in the groove. Over. And then backwards just to lock it in. Lift it up, and I'm kind of pinching them together. Stay lined up properly. Just take your time. As you sew, don't feel like you need to rush. If you make a mistake, if the track is too low or anything, just get your seam ripper, go across, you're using a zigzag stitch, and just take the stitching out and start it over, okay? It's better to make sure that it's done correctly so you won't have any issues. Continue on sewing until you get all the way to the end. Okay, so before you begin sewing, you want to make sure that your closure is faced on the outside, at least until you start getting used to making your wigs. And we're going to start at the bottom on this first line, and we're going to sew right around this curve. We're just going to follow the line right around, okay? So our tracks are double, and we're going to lay down our wig cap nice and flat.
Just some important notes I like to go over before you start sewing. So the first thing is that you want to make sure you do not stretch your wig cap, because if you stretch it too much, then your cap will expand and you'll start to have lumpy rows in your cap, which will stick through the hair that's covering it up. Okay? Make sure that the hair and any other part of the cap is not under any area where you are sewing. So make sure the closure is not under the cap. Make sure any other hair is not under the cap. Make sure that another part of the cap is not under the cap before you start sewing.
So we're going to start by laying our weft down right on top of our line that we mapped out. And when you begin, you're going to sew forward about a ½ inch, and then you're going to sew backwards another ½ inch, and then you're going to sew forward again. So you can do that about 3 times. So forward, back, and then forward, and then continue all the way across until you get to the end. When you reach the end, then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to sew forward one time, backwards one time, and then forward again. So this is going to lock in the end of your weft. At the end, cut the weft and the thread and begin the next row. And now you're going to repeat this process for all the rows that go from edge to edge. When you get up to the higher rows, make sure that you do not sew over the closure. Stop at the end of the line that you mapped out on the cap. So now we are at the top of the cap. As you can see, I went ahead and sewed on the first weft for this section. Here, we're going to sew strictly from left to right. So it's going to be like a straight line across. Remember, this is a tricky area, so make sure that you are not sewing over top of anything under the cap, and make sure that you don't sew across the other wefts that are at the end of each line. That's very important because you want to make sure that your cap doesn't come out with lumps in it. You want all your wefts to lay nice and flat. So let's begin. Always remember, sew forward once, backwards once, and then forward again and all the way across at the end of each weft, at the beginning and at the end of each weft. So at this point, you will probably have a little more difficulty getting the wig under the presser foot, but don't worry. Here I am putting the cap under the presser foot in the open area, then repositioning it until I reach the line that I will sew across next. So go ahead and repeat this process until you have completed sewing across all the lines. Make sure that you do not sew over top of the closure. Always sew around the closure.
Don't forget that when you start sewing, you want to go forward about a half of an inch and then go in reverse and then go forward all the way to the end and repeat the forward backward motion at the end of your weft just to make sure that you are locking in the stitch. Now, when you reach the last weft that you're going to sew next to the closure, just make sure that you do not place the weft over top of the closure. You want it to be adjacent to it, as if they are kissing each other, but not layered over top of the closure. And when you sew, you're going to sew in between the weft and the closure. Because you're doing the zigzag stitch, this is going to make the weft lay flat, and the closure and the weft are going to be attached to each other to seal up that space. So right here, I'm sewing to the end of my line that was mapped out. I'm not sewing over that open space. The reason is because the track that is below the one we are sewing on now is from another area. And so that area where that track is located is positioned in a way where it will be covered up by the closure. Now, what happened is that when I did the mapping was off just a little bit, but I was able to sew it down and position it below the closure where I know that it would have good coverage and it would not be exposed. So that's why it's so important to map out your tracks before you sew them on, because if anything gets unbalanced, you can still kind of keep a guide as you go along and make sure that you have very good coverage and you don't go over top of the area just because it's open and cause the wig to become a little bulky and kind of get bumps in it and everything. But this is still going to lay really flat. And plus, it's curly hair. So it's going to have a little volume to it. But even if it was straight hair, I know that it would still lay flat. I sew my wigs like this all the time. As you can see, there is a little opening on the other side, but there's still really good coverage. So the last thing that we're going to do is cut off the extra cap material. So what you want to do is you want to grab your scissors and we're going to cut right around the stitching. Do not cut on the stitching that we did. You're going to cut around it. Make sure that you are not cutting the lace that's under the cap, because then that's not going to be a good thing. So just continue to cut around the stitching, cut alongside the stitching. Make sure that you can see the stitching so that you don't accidentally cut any of the stitching. Okay, did I say that enough times? All right, so continue to cut around until you get to the end. And once you are done, that's it. And poof, voila, your wig is complete. So, this is a complete closure wig. You made a closure wig with me today. Hopefully, you really enjoyed making the wig. If it did not come out exactly the way that you wanted to, don't worry. If this is your first time, it's not going to be perfect. Practice makes perfect. So keep practicing. Come back and review this video again if you need to. But just whatever you do, just be patient with yourself. Take your time and do your best. By the time you get to your second or third unit, you will be a pro.